Welcome everyone. I'm joined here by Dr. Orko Chattopadhyay, who's running a course at the University of New South Wales next month. What's the dates of the course, Orko?
It's 18 to 22.
The 18th to the 22nd.
Yeah.
And I thought today we'd let Orko just discuss a few of the points around the lectures. So I read the synopsis, and the first lecture talks about truth in literature.
Mm-hmm.
And when I read that, the first thing I thought of is Lacan's famous maxim: the truth has the structure of a fiction.
Mm-hmm.
And I was wondering, can you say anything more about that?
Yeah. Okay. So, I think what is very interesting in that maxim, Lacan was always very keen on formalization, formulations, producing these little sentences which crystallize a lot of dense thinking, I guess. So, truth has the structure of a fiction. I think has a lot to do with especially the early Heideggerian kind of lineage of Lacan, where Heidegger is interested in this idea of truth as aletheia or alethes, which is about disconcealment, unpacking something which is concealed is disconcealed, and that's the process, or that's the working of truth. And it's Heidegger who actually makes a sort of an intrinsic connection between that process of truth telling, unraveling of truth, and literature. And the radical nature of that claim in Heidegger is the fact that truth telling is always a literary process. So not only are we looking at literature as a process of truth telling, but we are looking at all acts of truth telling which involve this unraveling as a kind of aesthetic process. So the unraveling is intrinsically aesthetic. And I think that's an important source or an important idea or an important formulation that Lacan thinks through and comes up with that idea of truth is structured like a fiction. But there's another interesting paradox in that sentence, which is where I think another very important distinction in the Lacanian thought comes across as a difference between the human animal and the non-human animal, in the sense that for Lacan, the human animal is defined by the fact that it can speak the truth in the form of a lie, through a lie. And while the non-human animal can also lie, we don't know whether the non-human animal is capable of saying truth through a lie. So another variation of that formula in Lacan is truth lies. Of course, when we bring this to literature, what is interesting is that literature is a very problematic field in this context precisely because fiction has that double meaning. Fiction is a literary genre, but fiction is also a lie.
Yeah.
It's a lie.
Yeah.
So literature as a construction has as much of a relation to truth as it has with lying. So literature is not only about truth telling, literature lies. Literature is about lies. And maybe literature also speaks the truth through lies, which is where I see one of the possible connections here. So, and whether or not literature has truth, one truth, many truths of its own, is a question, is an open question that I think we can only tackle when we are looking at specific texts with a certain mode of close reading, which I personally prefer, and of course relate that to psychoanalysis, but not in a model of application, more in a model of comparison. And sometimes, in fact, I think when we see certain literary texts closely in relation to psychoanalytic structures, the preference for me is always to read the psychoanalytic texts back from literature, from the literary texts, and try and see if the literary text can add a nuance or supplement a nuance to the psychoanalytic structure.
Okay.
So that's the idea, instead of applying psychoanalysis to literature.
Which is the traditional way people often approach
yes, or
the topic.
the way they would think about this relationship. But and I think, again, another reason why literature becomes important in this context is that if we read literature psychoanalytically, and of course this is not my claim, it's a claim which does the rounds in that sense, we are more interested in the failure of knowledge rather than the imparting of knowledge. Of course, literary texts, like other discourses, give us certain knowledge, offer certain knowledge. But we are looking at precisely the points where we reach a limit of that knowledge, a point where we do not know. For example, what is it that we do not know after we finish reading a book? How does a book mark the limit of its own knowledge, its own epistemic structure? Because again, in Lacan, that's another very important dialectic.
The lack.
Yes, because truth is the lack of knowledge. Truth is a point where knowledge collapses. And I think literature is an interesting, let's say, discourse to think through that point, precisely that point where knowledge collapses. So, yeah. And of course, there are many ways in which the knowledge can collapse, like a character. Now, when we are looking at it concretely through a literary text, again, there are multiple levels. There are things that a literary text may know in terms of what the narrator is saying, in terms of, I'm thinking of fiction primarily here, where there are characters and every character has a certain knowledge of things. And there are new knowledges which crop up as we have a progression of time. A character comes to know different things with the progress of time. But there are certain things which he or she does not know, and yet the narrative might know. So what do we do with that knowledge which the narrative knows, the character doesn't? What do we do with, let's say, an even more radical point where the narrative, the character, neither of them knows anything, but as readers, we know certain things. Or there might be certain things we do not know and the character knows, or we do not know and the narrative knows. So there are all these sort of very interesting, what I would say, cleavages in knowledge, little breaks in knowledge, where truth sort of erupts. And that's where we can bring in psychoanalysis, I think, to see those, to address those points where knowledge fails.
And I saw on the synopsis as well that your second lecture, you're going to be talking about logic and literature, and particularly that there's a literary logic.
Yeah.
To me, this is a whole... They almost seem like opposites, literature and logic.
Yes.
What's the relation between these two?
Yeah. Okay. So again, I'll step back a little bit and I'll come to this question of the relation between literature and logic. But before that, I just want to make one sort of general statement, I suppose, that when I'm talking about logic, I'm trying to place logic as the other of reason. So it's not a binary opposition between reason and unreason, where we generally talk about logic, something being logical and something being illogical, and they are generally held in a sort of binary structure, the logical and the illogical. But I'm trying to see a different kind of a dialectic where there is reason on the one hand and logic on the other. So what is called the irrational is not the other of the rational. So logic is the other of reason rather than unreason or irreason or irrationality. And again, I think this is one of the very, very basic sort of paradigm shifts, if I may put it like that, that Freud brings in with psychoanalysis, that the unconscious is not about unreason. Unconscious is not what we have posited as irrational. So this entire sort of occult, sort of the domain of the occult, which Freud talks about so much in his works. And Lacan has an interesting take that for Lacan, the occult is what is real for Freud, and real, under quotes, the Lacanian idea of the real as something which is inexpressible, impossible. The beyond of language, but in an immanent way, not in a transcendental, spiritual, mystical kind of a manner. But so Freud sort of theorizes the unconscious, and the unconscious supplements or replaces, shall I say, a whole territory which is, or which was before his discovery, governed by the occult, governed by irrationality. So I think Freud has a very important point there, that there is logic in the unconscious. Unconscious is a logical structure. Something that, of course, Lacan expounds when he says unconscious is structured like a language. So it has its own logic. And that language, when, especially in the later teachings of Lacan, the implication of that maxim, unconscious is structured like a language, is more mathematical than the content-based idea of language as communication, which is something that he in any case resists, even in his earlier works. So to sort of start at least approaching your question, because I've been sort of stepping back a long way there. There is logic in literature insofar as literature has a structure. And in a structure, there is a certain operation of logic. There are rules, there are repetitions, there are iterations, reiterations, and it's a process. It's like almost like a mathematical structure. But, and this is where, of course, the binary opposition of rationality and irrationality is broken down. In literature, I think there's a way logic works through in the Freudian sense and reaches a point of its own exhaustion. And this, I think, is tied up with your first question, where I was talking about this point when knowledge collapses. So for psychoanalysis, and this is where I think again the homology can be drawn between psychoanalysis and literature, that for both psychoanalysis and literature, there's a point where logic reaches its limit. And this idea of the limit will keep coming back because it's so crucial to the Lacanian way of thinking. You think only to push your thoughts towards the limit of the unthinkable. So in that sense, I think literature shows us how logic is at work, but how logic also unworks itself, if I may put it like that. So we reach a point where a logical structure doesn't work anymore. Now, if I may anticipate a question, which is which would be a very obvious question that would be posed to me, I guess, if I'm sort of pursuing this line of argument, that, well, deconstruction, for example, has already done that. Why do you need psychoanalysis in literary studies to push logic to this point of collapse?
Deconstruction has already done that. Why do you need this? Tell me.
Yes. So yeah, to answer the anticipatory question, and you've see, this is the point. In literature, there's always, as I was saying, there's an iteration and there's a reiteration. So I anticipated a question and you voiced the question. Now the interesting point there logically would be to see the difference between these two iterations.
Right.
So yeah. So to come back to that question, why do we need psychoanalysis? I think one very simple answer to that would be, in psychoanalysis, logic is not simply logic. Logic relates to affect. Logic relates to sexuality in a very important way, because, again, if I'm specific to Lacan here, Lacan's elaboration of logic is almost throughout his sort of corpus of lectures especially in the later teachings, because that's where logic becomes more and more important, it's always in the context of sexuality. Of course, scholars have made this argument, and I think it's perfectly fine to see this as logic in itself. But it's also a sexuated logic. It's a logic of sexuation, as Lacan would say, about the sexes.
What's the maximum we were talking about in Melbourne? The penis is -1. What's that?
Yes,
it almost again.
Yes,
it sounds like a logical statement.
Yes, it is.
But sorry, I've interrupted.
No. It is, and it's something that clearly did not go down well with mathematicians who didn't want to understand psychoanalysis and wanted to sort of have pot shots at Lacan for that statement and a few other statements. But yeah, the phallus is like a. And he uses mathematical notations for phallus. The notation that he would often use is the phi, the minus phi as well for castration. So, So to perhaps step back a little bit, what is it that psychoanalysis does and deconstruction doesn't in terms of approaching literature through a collapse of logic? Seeing literature as a logical structure, which also collapses at a certain point, because the essential idea of deconstruction is, and I should say this because I've sort of drawn this distinction, the very simplified idea of deconstructive literary criticism is to see a text against its grain, where the text itself undoes its dominant claim. So there's a logic that the text is building up, and it tries to put a claim forward, but it's that very claim which gets sabotaged by the text itself, by the, shall we say, textual unconscious. Now, there are two things to say here. First is that, of course, as we all know, the central figure of deconstruction, Jacques Derrida, has a lot to do with Freud, and a lot of these readings of Derrida have to do with a certain Freudian structure. So there is psychoanalysis in deconstruction. It's again a fairly fundamental point, but sometimes it's forgotten. So I just wanted to sort of flag that in a sense. The logic of deconstruction is not non-psychoanalytic. If we look at Derrida's engagement with psychoanalysis, it's very serious. It's very thorough. Let me not go further than that into it, because it's a different territory, but throughout his life, Freud is one of his most important teachers, as important as someone like Heidegger. Okay. And later on, he gets into the politics of psychoanalysis, and he almost ends up identifying himself with another set of psychoanalysts in a very different tradition. And he maintains a very critical relationship with Lacan, of course, with strong battles from both ends. But I think what psychoanalysis does in terms of that logic is to put that in connection with other fields, not only of knowledge, but, as I said, fields like sexuality, fields like affect. So we are not necessarily closing ourselves down to this structuralist notion of a text having its own logic, or a character having its own logic, or literature having its own logic. Of course it does, but it's an affective logic, it's a sexuated logic. It's a logic of love, which is one of the perennial themes of literature. There's always some vision of love, even in the most non-romantic texts. So love is a very important field, love and sexuality, where logic sort of has a work to do. And that's precisely where psychoanalysis becomes, I think, different from a potentially deconstructive criticism of literature, where, again, we are looking at a failure of logic. So for Lacan, again, logic, he has this statement in Seminar 21, logic as the science of the real. And that's precisely the point where mathematical logic, and again, for Lacan, he's interested in that point of connection between mathematics and logic, which is why he eventually goes to the Borromean logic, which is a geometric logic, which is clearly a mathematical logic. So
goes on to topology,
yes,
which again is traditionally in the field of mathematics.
Yes, absolutely. And topology, this is also an interesting connection for strategic reasons, becomes very important for Lacan because it is surface geometry. And it, on a very fundamental level, it opposes the idea of depth psychoanalysis, or this idea of depth psychology, which was one way of reading Freud. Of course, for Lacan, there is no depth of the mind or anything like that. Unconscious is outside, which is one of his most
Extimate.
interesting. Yes, absolutely. It's extimate. So it's
One of
inside,
his
exteriorized.
neologisms.
Yes. And that's topological, isn't it? Like that turn where the interior becomes exterior is topological, and that's why he's so interested in these figures like cross cap or Mobius strip or Klein bottle, because all these topological structures show how the inside of a structure can also be its outside. So there's no distinction, hard distinction at least, between the inside and the outside. So that's again logical, and again that's something that we can think in relation to literature. How literature exteriorizes the interior and interiorizes the exterior, which is the topological operation. Of course, I think it's quite passé to say it exteriorizes the interior, because clearly we can say that from the authorial point of view. We can say that from the characterological point of view, that characters are exteriorizing their interiors. Author, after all, a book is made by an author, and it's his interior in a sense. But that interior can never be simply an interior.
And the author's book is in one way his form of speaking to the world. And
yes.
I remember reading the synopsis about your last lecture, and it's about the body and speech.
Yeah.
And Lacan's got a maxim that says, I speak with my body, and I do so unbeknownst to myself. Thus, I say more than I know.
Yeah.
And the very first time I read that, I was like, oh, I get that. I totally get that. It was. So what can you say something more about that? That's going to be the topic of your final lecture.
Yeah. And that's a great quote. I should have that in my lecture. I think that's a great quote. Yeah. So the body, the function of the body, I guess. Right. So yeah, I think again we're looking at a sort of a very complex network of a few things here. When we talk about the speaking body, the speaking being, and Lacan has this quite a complex kind of a French pun, par l'être, which is one of the ways in which he sort of defines the unconscious in his later work. Par l'être is the speaking being, but this being is clearly, because this is another fundamental difference between Lacan and a philosopher. He doesn't have a solid ontology. This is a famous question that Jacques-Alain Miller put to Lacan at one point. What is your ontology? And Lacan had various things to say at different points. It was not a specific answer that he gave. And he doesn't have a solid ontology. His ontology is based on lack, a being which is lacking. And he doesn't believe in being in the philosophical sense of the term being.
And I was reading the other day that Lacan and Slavoj Žižek are criticised as being anti-philosophical.
Yes, absolutely. And I think it's very important to acknowledge this anti-philosophy, because again, yes, they're often criticized by some scholars as anti-philosophers, but I think this tag or this category of anti-philosopher or anti-philosophy can also be taken in a more neutral way, or perhaps in a more positive way, because again, someone like Alain Badiou would say that yes, Lacan is the iconic anti-philosopher, but it's precisely from anti-philosophy that philosophy draws its dialectical energy. So philosophy affirms itself in relation to anti-philosophy. And that's precisely the relation between Badiou and Lacan. For Badiou, Lacan is the iconic anti-philosopher, and it's around Lacan, against Lacan perhaps in a sense, that he frames his own philosophy. It's Lacanian anti-philosophy that facilitates his own philosophical discourse. And he's quite a classic example of a philosopher, a very strong philosopher who builds up a system, makes a system, and so on and so forth. But again, to come back to the question, I suppose, um, yes, so we speak with our body. We always know more than what we think we know. So that's where the split happens between the Cartesian and the Cartesian conscious subject and the subject of the unconscious, as Lacan would say that, I think, therefore I am. This therefore is a break. The I before the therefore and the I after the therefore, they're not the same.
Lacan's rephrasing of that Cartesian maxim is, I think where I am not.
Yes, yes. And there's some absolutely mind-breaking things he has to say about that. Like, at one point he would say exactly what you said. I am where I'm not the plaything of my thoughts. I am where I do not think. At another place, he has a very complex, and I must say, I haven't got my head around this maxim very clearly, but there's another important tweaking that Lacan does to that Cartesian maxim, which is either you do not think or you are not. So he negates both sides of the maxim in an either or structure, which is very different logically. But what is interesting again is the way in which all these supplementations, tweakings are logical. He's using logic as a tool, as a method to break certain structures, not to make certain structures, but more to break certain structures. But again, let's come back to the question, because I think I'm going far afield. Speaking body. So the speaking being, or the par l'être, is, for Lacan, this being is the being of the body, because he doesn't really approve of the philosophical notion of being qua being, which is being in itself, which is the in a sense the bulwark of philosophy. It's the foundation of the philosophical discourse. But for Lacan, there is no being qua being. There's only a being of the body, and it's a body, this is the interesting point, which enjoys. So we enjoy the fact that we speak. I'm pretty sure we are both enjoying the fact that we are speaking now. But that's a conscious enjoyment. The Lacanian idea of jouissance is, of course, more centered around the notion of unconscious enjoyment, where we enjoy our speech without having known it as such, without knowing it. But there's a tweak there again. Our speech also enjoys us. And we don't know anything about that. So I think, so to come back to the idea of the speaking body, and I think this is something that is now being acknowledged more and more in Lacanian psychoanalysis, because Lacan's early figuration of the body was predominantly the imaginary figuration of the body. He has the three structures, of course, imaginary, symbolic, and real. And his early thoughts on the body were almost entirely this body of the imaginary, body as an image, the body that the child encounters in the mirror, which is also a complete body. And it's a fiction, because at that stage, the child clearly doesn't have a complete body. It's still dependent on the other just to prop itself up in front of the mirror. Because we are essentially looking at a child between 6 months or 18 months or whatever. That's the first encounter potentially, or even before that perhaps, with the mirror. These days with technology, I'm pretty sure a child knows how to take a selfie at the age of 6 months or whatever. So there's a mirror there. So that early idea of body in Lacan is a primarily imaginary notion of the body. But I think where I want to push this is this idea of the real body, a body in the real, a body of the real. And because these three categories, the imaginary, the symbolic, and the real, are inextricable in the final teachings of Lacan, they're like a Borromean knot where every single string, let's say it's a knot of three strings, and it's an equivalent structure. Any of the three strings can be the real or the imaginary or the symbolic. And they always exist in that inseparable structure. So there's a real body, a symbolic body, and an imaginary body, which are not discrete. They're tied up with one another. Now, the question is to address the body in the real, or the body of the real, or the real of the body. So there's a real element of the body, which is not symbolized, which is not something that we can speak of, which is not something that we even speak through. And the way I understand this real in the body, of the body, whatever, is the limits of the body. So again, we come back to that same notion of the limit in terms of the partial objects, the drives that Freud talked about, of course, and the points where the interaction between the self and the other happens. Like, I see you because I have cuts here in the form of an eye. That's the limit of the body in a sense. That's the sort of topological margin of the body. I can smell someone because I have, again, cuts here. So the cuts of the body, for example, would be very important in that notion of the body as a topological margin, the body in the real, the body of the real. But that's very important for the intersubjective structure, which is also what houses the unconscious in a sense. The unconscious is in that discourse between the self and the other, and how the other is sort of appropriated, not appropriated, rejected, how the other explodes in us, and so on.
You've given us a very, very good taste of what is in store for your course next month. So thank you very much for taking the time to give us a bit of a demo.
No, thanks to you for all these interesting questions, and you know, it's always great to talk about these things because there's a lot of brainstorming there.
Yes. Thanks for watching. If you like the video, make sure you hit like, and we might even post another one if we get enough interest. So thanks again.
Thank you.